The night skies over the Levant shimmered with the fading trails of intercepted rockets. For weeks, cities across Israel had lived under the hum of sirens and the pulse of dread, while Iranian-backed militias unleashed wave after wave of retaliation. The Iron Dome, once viewed as impenetrable, had begun to show fatigue, its operators pushed to their limits, its systems strained from saturation. Tel Aviv, long spared from the brunt of regional firepower, now bore the scars of a conflict that had spiraled far beyond political brinkmanship. Prime Minister Eliav Zur stood before the war cabinet in Jerusalem, his face pale but defiant under the cold fluorescent lights. He wasn't just managing a war, he was surviving a storm of accusations, internal pressure, and the unforgiving calculus of national defense. Across the table, General Aharon Segev laid out the latest battle maps, showing Iranian proxies closing in from the Golan and Hezbollah units entrenching in southern Lebanon. "We've held them at bay," he said. "But it's a war of attrition now. The next week decides everything." In Tehran, Major General Qasem Nadiri reviewed the same maps, albeit inverted. Iran's strategy wasn't conquest, but erosion, bleeding Israel's will to fight through persistent regional pressure. Fordow and Natanz remained under high alert, especially after rumors of an Israeli cyberstrike had briefly knocked out communication grids in Isfahan. Iran's elite cyber unit, Shabgard, had been mobilized days ago, seeking to breach Israeli infrastructure and create enough civilian disruption to force a political settlement. On the global stage, the world watched with uneasy fascination. The U.S. was paralyzed in election season turmoil. Russia, bogged down in Ukraine, issued ambiguous statements of neutrality. China called for restraint while quietly recalibrating oil contracts. For the first time in years, the Middle East conflict wasn't just a sideshow. It was center stage, with the potential to redraw alliances, shift oil markets, and ignite a wider war. As missiles continued to arc across the sky, it was the civilians who bore the brunt. In Haifa, families huddled in shelters as blackout orders persisted for days. In Shiraz, rumors of retaliatory Israeli air raids caused panic buying of essentials. Across both nations, social media surged with images of destruction, some real, some fabricated, all fueling the cycle of fear. But something shifted in the third week. A miscalculated drone strike outside Najaf accidentally hit a civilian convoy. Among the casualties were medical volunteers from a neutral NGO, their deaths quickly condemned by both sides. Public opinion, especially in Europe and the Gulf, turned swiftly against further escalation. Diplomatic pressure intensified. France, Qatar, and Oman jointly proposed an emergency summit, while the UN Secretary-General issued a rare ultimatum: negotiate or risk international sanctions from both East and West. In Israel, internal polls showed a growing percentage of the population demanding a ceasefire, not out of fear, but fatigue. The resolve that once hardened with each attack now showed signs of erosion. Prime Minister Zur, previously unwavering in his tone, began to shift his rhetoric from victory to security. "We must ensure the safety of our people not just today, but for generations," he said in a nationally televised address. Iran, too, faced its own reckoning. The rial had collapsed 18% in 2 weeks. Protests simmered under the surface in cities like Mashhad and Tabriz. Ayatollah Javadi, a powerful cleric with growing influence, issued a rare rebuke of continued hostilities. "A war fought without end becomes a graveyard for wisdom," he declared during Friday prayers. The back channel opened that evening. Through a secure Qatari line, Israeli and Iranian intermediaries began what would become the foundation of the ceasefire agreement. It wasn't diplomacy born of trust, but necessity. Both sides knew they couldn't win outright. The question was how to end the war without appearing defeated. Over 5 nights of encrypted negotiations, they hammered out terms. Missile launch zones would be restricted. Militia activities would be curbed under monitored limits. Cyber operations would be frozen temporarily, and humanitarian corridors opened under third-party oversight. The final clause, buried deep in the agreement, was the most sensitive. Iran would halt uranium enrichment beyond 60% for 6 months, and Israel would cease its sabotage campaigns, for now. At sunrise on the 6th day, the ceasefire was announced. There was no celebration, no victory parade, just silence, and for millions, that was enough. But even in that silence, questions remained. Had either side truly won, or had they simply hit pause on a war neither could afford to lose? As the skies cleared over Tel Aviv and Tehran, one truth remained undeniable. This was not peace. It was preparation. And the next battle, when it came, would not wait for permission. In the muted days following the ceasefire, the war did not end. It merely changed shape. In Tel Aviv's Kiryat Defense Complex, Prime Minister Eliav Zur convened a closed-door meeting with Mossad Director Yael Hoffman and General Aharon Segev. The War Cabinet had shifted from operational command to political messaging, trying to define the ceasefire not as compromise, but as calculated triumph. The goal was to degrade Iranian escalation capacity, Zur insisted. We've done that without an invasion or international fallout. This is a strategic success. But within Mossad's inner circles, the definition of success was far less certain. Yael had her doubts. Intelligence intercepts suggested that while Iran had pulled back missile assets, it had deepened its proxy integration. Hezbollah fighters had melted back into civilian structures across southern Lebanon. In Iraq and Syria, new drone warehouses had sprung up overnight, disguised as aid depots but flagged by satellite imagery as weapons caches. They haven't stepped back, Yael warned. They've stepped sideways. Meanwhile, Tehran was orchestrating its own narrative. In a nationally broadcast speech, President Ebrahim Karimi stood before a massive Iranian flag and declared, "Strategic resistance victorious." Crowds cheered in Revolution Square, waving portraits of martyrs alongside flags of Hezbollah, Hasht al-Shabi, and the IRGC. Yet in the upper echelons of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the mood was more cautious. General Qasem Nadiri acknowledged that Iran had preserved its strategic depth but at significant cost. Economic unrest was growing, and even the conservative press had begun asking uncomfortable questions. What Iran did win, however, was something less tangible but more powerful: time. With uranium enrichment paused but centrifuge infrastructure untouched, Iran could resume its program at will. Its nuclear deterrent was dented but not disabled, and while it had restrained its proxies, it had not dismantled them. In a post-war memo to the Supreme Leader, Nadiri wrote, "Our enemies believe we've conceded. Let them. We remain where we need to be, waiting." Israel, too, was recalibrating. The Iron Dome's performance had been both heroic and revealing. While intercept rates were high, the system had been stressed beyond intended limits. A classified IDF report concluded that a multi-front assault, particularly with precision-guided munitions, could overwhelm current defense layers. Plans were initiated to fast-track development of the Iron Beam laser system, but even that would take time. "We have superiority, not invincibility," Segev reminded the cabinet. "If they adapt faster than we do, next time we pay in lives." Public sentiment mirrored this strategic ambiguity. In Jerusalem, some citizens hailed the ceasefire as a diplomatic win, a moment of restraint that avoided wider catastrophe. Others saw it as unfinished business, a pause that left too many enemies breathing. Across the ocean, American analysts split the same way. The Biden administration took credit for brokering Gulf support for talks, but the Pentagon remained uneasy. "Iran kept its proxies intact and learned our targeting patterns," warned one senior official in a leaked briefing. "They lost a few teeth, but not the ability to bite." In Iran, Whispers of discontent grew louder. The middle class, already battered by inflation and sanctions, now faced power shortages and fuel lines. Social media posts, despite heavy censorship, showed quiet protests erupting in Tabriz and Kermanshah. "What did we win?" one young Iranian tweeted before the post was deleted. "The graves of our sons and the silence of our leaders." But for the IRGC, the ceasefire offered a fresh opportunity: reorganization. Units that had suffered heavy drone strikes were quietly reabsorbed into civilian agencies. Their weapons dispersed into rural safe houses, far from the predictable vectors of Israeli surveillance. Even Shabgard, Iran's elite cyber division, went dark, its servers rerouted, its leaders silent. It was as if the IRGC had dissolved, and yet somehow grown more present. Mossad's Yael called it strategic opacity, the kind that made counteraction nearly impossible. Still, there was one player neither side could fully control: Hezbollah. Emboldened by its ability to strike deep into Israeli territory, the group released a string of videos boasting of victories over the Zionist enemy. But internal IRGC communications showed frustration. Hezbollah had acted with too much autonomy, striking targets without coordination and risking escalation beyond Tehran's control. Nadiri ordered a quiet review of the group's operational independence. He knew too much firepower in the hands of unpredictable allies could burn the hand that fed them. Back in Israel, Zur faced growing political opposition. The far right accused him of cowardice, the left of recklessness. Yet he held his ground. "The battlefield is not the only measure of war," he told the Knesset. "Sometimes restraint is the sharper sword." His words earned applause from moderates but fell flat with a population still sleeping in bunkers, still haunted by sirens in the night. And then come the leak. An internal document from Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was intercepted, its contents shocking. It detailed a proposed underground expansion site near Iraq, deeper and more protected than Fordow. If verified, it would mean Iran never intended to halt its nuclear ambitions, only to shield them more effectively. The revelation rocked both sides. Israel scrambled jets for reconnaissance. Washington convened a closed-door emergency session at the Pentagon. Tehran denied the existence of the site. Suddenly, the ceasefire seemed less like a turning point and more like a chess move. One side had pressed pause, not to concede but to reposition, and the other had accepted the silence, knowing it might only last until the next provocation. By the time Zur received the next security briefing, the quiet had become deafening. It wasn't peace, it was pressure, and everyone knew it wouldn't last. Rain fell softly on the scorched earth outside Natanz, as if nature itself had chosen to wash the last ash from a war that hadn't quite ended. The ceasefire held, at least technically. Yet for the strategists, spies, and soldiers on both sides, this lull was not peace. It was a rehearsal for the next chapter. In Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Eliav Tzur stared out his office window, the city behind him a mosaic of blinking lights and frayed nerves. His advisors had left hours ago, but sleep hadn't come. The question gnawed at him. Had they truly bought security or merely borrowed time? He wasn't alone in his doubt. In Tehran, General Qasem Nadiri was conducting drills under a veil of secrecy. The new underground facility near Iraq, still officially denied, was progressing rapidly. Shielded deeper than Fordow and twice as redundant, the engineers had promised. Whether it would ever go operational depended less on uranium and more on deterrence. Iran didn't need a bomb to threaten one, it only needed ambiguity. And now, more than ever, it had the shadows to hide in. The new battlegrounds were not only physical, but digital. Mossad's cyber division had intercepted code fragments suggesting that Iran was testing advanced worm variants, capable of bypassing Israeli firewalls through AI-enhanced mimicry. It was no longer a question of launching missiles. The front line had moved to power grids, traffic systems, even hospitals. A single keystroke could trigger chaos. Yael Hoffman, no longer satisfied with passive defense, ordered offensive algorithms developed in coordination with Unit 8200. "If the next war starts in cyberspace," she said, "we're not waiting to be hit first." But perhaps the most dangerous weapon now was perception. On Iranian state television, a documentary aired glorifying the nation's resilience, carefully omitting the economic downturn and internal unrest. Footage showed missile launches, weeping families of martyrs, and the Ayatollah in silent prayer, crafted to inspire, not inform. In Israel, a different kind of propaganda emerged. Social media flooded with stylized videos of Iron Dome interceptions, footage of precision drone strikes, and montages of Israeli families returning to schools and cafes. The narrative was simple: strength through survival. And yet beneath the curated reels, the people were restless. Israeli parents hesitated to send their children back to schools within rocket range. Iranian shopkeepers whispered about another spike in fuel prices. Trust had been eroded, not just in the enemy, but in their own governments. The war may have paused, but its psychological echo persisted. Meanwhile, in Beirut's southern suburbs, a meeting took place that would not be documented in any official archive. Representatives from Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard convened quietly, reviewing the impact of the last campaign. They agreed on one thing: the next confrontation must be less predictable. Instead of missiles, perhaps economic warfare. Instead of drones, perhaps disinformation. The methods would shift, but the aim would not. "Israel must remain distracted," one commander said, "always uncertain, always watching the skies." Even Washington, now outwardly focused on the Pacific theater, kept one eye trained on the region. Satellite imagery revealed unusual construction near Syria's Al-Bukamal border crossing, a possible Iranian land corridor being reinforced under civilian camouflage. Pentagon analysts submitted a memo titled "Post-Ceasefire Proliferation Risks," but the document barely registered in the news cycle. The world, exhausted by conflict, wanted the illusion of peace more than the truth of what lingered underneath. Zur knew this. He had lived through enough escalations to recognize a false calm. But politically, he had little choice. His coalition held by a thread, and the public, though uneasy, was not yet ready for renewed war. Still, he ordered quiet military drills to resume in the Negev. "No announcements," he told his generals. "Train in silence. Fight in darkness if it comes to that." Nadiri, for his part, was planning something similar. He had begun a rotation of commanders across Syria and Iraq, obscuring their deployment patterns. Even his own inner circle didn't know when or where the next proxy flare-up would ignite. But he understood the stakes. Iran couldn't afford another direct confrontation with Israel, at least not until its deterrent, real or perceived, was ready. That deterrent hung in the air like a loaded question. Did Iran already possess a nuclear warhead? Mossad didn't think so. But the uncertainty alone reshaped every decision. Would Israel strike preemptively if it believed enrichment had resumed? Would the U.S. intervene again if Iran escalated through proxies? The entire region existed in suspended calculation, a chessboard where no piece could be moved without risking the collapse of the table itself. And yet, there was a strange symmetry to it all. Two nations, bound by hatred and history, locked in a cycle that neither could escape nor fully win. Their leaders made speeches, their soldiers trained, their spies plotted, but beneath it all was the same quiet truth. Each needed the other to justify its vigilance. A world without the other's threat would be a world without purpose. On a stormy evening in Jerusalem, Zur met with a group of intelligence veterans. Over black coffee and old maps, one of them, gray-haired and blunt, said, "We didn't end the war. We just learned how to live inside it." Zur didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because as long as Tehran whispered in code and Jerusalem answered in silence, as long as drones cast shadows over desert skies and cyber weapons hid behind innocent cliques, the ceasefire would remain what it always was, not an ending, but a countdown.